And for our second keynote, I'd like to welcome Bhaskar Mitra, who's going to be taking us through some work that they've been doing on critical approaches to technology. So hopefully you can share your screen and we can get started.
Thanks
Perfect.
so much.
Take it
Thanks so
away.
much, Darren. Thanks so much, Darren. Hello, everyone. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here with you all today. Um, I will get my slides up. Yeah. I will confess I am a little bit of an imposter at this conference because I don't directly work on libraries or library science. But I am, my background is in information retrieval, which can be positioned at the intersection of computing and library and information sciences. So IR as a field studies and develops tools such as search engines, recommender systems, and chatbots, and our roots are in library information science and linguistics. So this is particularly a really great opportunity for me to come and speak to a community that I consider as the kind of the roots of my current field. Um, in information retrieval, the societal implication questions, and obviously becomes really important. And I don't think I need to really make a case for this with this audience. It would be pretty obvious. But to think about these large IR systems, these systems at scale modulate what information gets exposure, and through that act of modulation, it shapes in very significant ways, like consumer behavior, political discourse, culture, and obviously economic outcomes. Um, and so the provocation for my talk today is this particular question, which is what is the role of computer mediated information access in our collective struggles for social justice, universal humanization, and emancipation? And so this is probably the audience where I need to make this point like the least. I think everybody in this audience would immediately agree with me that politics, that information and access to information is saliently political. It has been true, not just with today's online information access systems from the web, but also going back to libraries and every other form of media, from print media, radio, televisions, and more recently, social media, as well as information access platforms like search engines, chatbots, and recommender systems. And this is particularly because information is critical to our collective sense making of our place in this world and our relationships with each other. And so, therefore, historically, and it is ongoing, that the authoritarian forces have always tried to control what information is disseminated and how, because information access platforms represent the site for one of the site for conflict between liberation and oppression. And this Orwellian scenario is not just something we can point to the past and say these things happened, nor can we just consider them as something that is plausible in future. These are things that we are now witnessing in real time in the present day, right? So I'm talking about, for example, if you look at some of the executive orders coming out in the US, that is specific intentionally trying to impose certain harmful ideologies on what kind of output or kind of values that chatbots and others can and espouse. And we are also seeing private actors like Elon Musk and Grok. What's happening with Grok in terms of promoting white genocide, conspiracy theories about South Africa, about espousing literally Nazi kind of beliefs, and all the way to other state actors like looking at DeepSeek model that refuses to talk about Tiananmen Square and Taiwan. So we are witnessing this kind of a concerted effort both from authoritarian state actors and private actors to capture our information access platforms and the kind of conversations that we can have and the kind of information that we have access to through these tools. And while these concerns have been have been true for a pretty long time with online information access. So, for example, the amount of data that these platforms have been collecting from the users has been true for at this point, at least for a couple of decades. But there are certain new pieces to the puzzle that have emerged that I think which makes these concerns particularly serious in today's world. And the couple of these that I'm referring to are one is the the new generative AI's capability to produce really persuasive language and visualization that can be very subtle but very effective at manipulating people's beliefs. And the second is the ability for the whoever is the owner of this platform or who can exercise control over this platform, their ability to then align these models either through kind of prompt engineering or certain kind of like computing approaches like RLHF or alignment approaches as it is called in my field, to align these models to certain kind of ideologies and values and belief systems, right? So if you take this, combine these three things, the amount of data these platforms have on people, the ability to generate persuasive language and visualization, and the ability to program these chatbots to actually do this, I believe that this poses a serious risk of creating tools for mass manipulation of public preferences, whether it is consumer preferences or political opinion. So imagine kind of like, the scenario where every information access query that you do to a search engine, or if you have a digital assistant that you're talking to, every information that you accessed is subtly modified to over time affect a change in your belief system. And even if you were to imagine that the corporate actors that have the control and power over these platforms were good actors, and we definitely should not be making such a assumption, such a generalized assumption. But even if for a second we were to assume that was true, we know that just by the existence of this capabilities, it creates the incentive for authoritarian state actors or other actors to capture these platforms. And so in my community, in the computing community, in AI and IR communities, there has been some recognition of this, but I would say it is still pretty limited under the kind of the terminology or banner of AI persuasion. So there has been a bit of literature on this already, but I still haven't seen a kind of a significant concerted effort to kind of counter this yet. Definitely, there are people who are actively working on this problem. And where this starts getting even more kind of scary is like kind of thinking a few steps ahead of what is kind of the next version of this that it might look like. So think about, like, for example, explicitly, not just through like your regular information access, but explicitly through advertisement, like generative AI being used to generate ads that are specifically tuned to persuade you based on whatever everything that the platform knows about you and what would be appealing to you. Think also about what this means for digital blackface. For example, imagine the scenario where a group of cis white men might be coding up videos that shows, let's say, a queer black woman talking about espousing certain political belief points that is completely contrasting to the community or such a person. So imagine those kind of tools coming into the foray where and everybody has access to manipulate people, and having that power over these platforms and tools being concentrated within big tech and other authoritarian state actors. So that's kind of the concern that I am starting with. And these concerns with the technologies that are emerging are not happening in vacuum, right? Because we have seen for more, like way more than like at least a few decades at this point, big tech's very explicit alignment with authoritarianism, all the way from building the carceral and surveillance technologies to providing material kind of cloud and other compute support for ongoing war and genocide across the world. And to the point where these, many of these big tech leaders are espousing these kind of very authoritarian and carceral kind of visions of the future at this point, very, very openly. They don't even trying to hide this. And also in tech, something that I'm going to mention here, although I won't have the time to really go into details, but there are also these other ideologies that are emerging, like hugely, hugely problematic. So, for example, there is this kind of really classical work that, Timnit Gebru and Emile Torres did a few years ago to kind of shine a light on this a particular bundle of ideologies called what they called as the TESCREAL ideologies. So, the TESCREAL here is an acronym where each of the alphabets here stand for one of the ideologies. So, for example, the T stands for transhumanism, one of the E stands for effective altruism, the L stands for long-termism, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these ideologies, this group of ideologies, are very, very problematic with certain connections with to directly to eugenics and race science, and is fueling a lot of kind of pseudo intellectual conversations that are taking over much of quite a bit of the significant part of the computing community with respect to existential risk and AI safety, that kind of starts almost conspiratorially imagining that AI will become so super intelligent that it is going to destroy the world, and shifting away all the focus from the actual harm, the actual reification of old colonial extractive practices and other labor exploitation practices that are today causing serious harm from these kind of technologies. And so shifting away the light from those serious harms to kind of almost conspiratorial imagined harms. I'd also definitely, people, for anyone interested, strongly encourage to also check out Shazida Ahmed's work, where she and her co-authors really delved into how some of these movements that have been very well funded by very high net worth individuals and institutions actually came from kind of pseudo intellectual practices from web forums where they were kind of mimicking scholarly practices but not really so, and now trying to kind of get validity within the computing community, and have lots of very serious and powerful people in tech who actually subscribe to these ideologies. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I did want to kind of at least put in a little bit of breadcrumb for people to follow on and find more information about this. And so taking a step back, so big tech now finds itself in not so good company with big tobacco, big oil, and big pharma. And as Will Oremus kind of very eloquently puts it, when society prepends the label big with the capital B to an industry, it's never out of respect or admiration. It does it out of loathing and fear and in preparation for battle. And so one of the ways that big tech particularly mirrors these, the likes of big tobacco, big oil, and big pharma, is how we see the kind of strategies that the oligopolistic corporations in this industry tries to exert undue influence on to shape public decision making. And they try to do this through capture of knowledge production in academic in the academic environment. It is through the capture of regulatory bodies that are supposed to regulate these industries themselves being captured, as well as capturing how these industry is the media discourse and how these industries are represented by media, in popular media, both official media as well as in social media. So there is a set of different, again, kind of literature that talks about some of these different strategies that these industries, especially big tech, has adopted. We did some recent work that got just accepted and will be presented at the FACT conference in Montreal later this summer. So this is work that is coming out of Abiba Berhane's AI Accountability Lab in Ireland, and I had the really good opportunity to collaborate on this project with them, where we looked at some of the different mechanisms that the big tech is currently employing, especially for regulatory capture, and how this parallels some of the mechanisms that has been employed by, again, big tobacco, big oil, and big pharma. And so this includes things like lobbying, revolving door in terms of hiring, standard setting via monopoly, threatening to relocate development and labor to counter any kind of strict regulation, to also play playing victims, and also weaponizing ethics and other kinds of things for ethics washing these corporations. And so on this, I want to take maybe a quick 30 seconds or a minute to also do a little bit of a personal note here on my own background. So I actually worked in big tech for 19 years at Microsoft, first at Bing and then at Microsoft Research. And last year, I was affected by a layoff, but that layoff was genuinely, I think, one of the best things that happened to me, because it gave me a nudge that I really needed to kind of really listen to something that I've been feeling increasingly concerned about, the role of big tech in society. So I decided last year, when the layoff happened, to kind of explicitly and actually publicly kind of announce that I will be leaving the big tech Silicon Valley ecosystem altogether, because of its very active role today in class oppression, propping up authoritarianism, and in particular in their material support for the ongoing genocide in Palestine. So when I'm talking about kind of propping up fascism and authoritarianism, I want to make this more clear what I'm referring to. So there's definitely kind of the aspects of AI persuasion and capture of our information access ecosystem, and in terms of trying to control what can and cannot be said. But it also connects with kind of the carceral and surveillance technologies that are coming out of from this industry. When I'm talking about class oppression, I'm definitely referring to how, for example, AI technologies are built on misappropriated, stolen, and undercompensated data labor. I'm also talking about how these technologies explicitly their goal is to commodify labor and bring down the cost of labor. And it's not just even the technology. I also want to shine a light here about the technological project of AI, but also contrasting it with the much larger political project of AI, where if you look at the AI narrative, the propaganda, the hype, that itself becomes the product, because it's not just about what the technology actually tries, like even if the technology did make you productive, it's not about whether the technology, let's say, makes you 10% productive, or maybe it even intensifies your work, these tools does. What really matters is what you have convinced, the society, is the impact of these tools. So if the AI hype has convinced that your AI is going to make your employees 10x faster, then that is what is going to provide the cover for the employer to pay you, compensate you 10x lesser, independent of the truth whether this the tool is actually might be making you only 10% more productive, or maybe even intensifying your work, right? And that is to leave alone, the topic of how this work is, or these tools are also distancing people from their craft of, let's say, authors from their writing, journalists from doing the actual kind of writing or creating art, and so on and so forth across different industries. Last but not the least, in the kind of the active role in class oppression, I also want to shine a light about how even these narratives that AI is going to be your next teacher or your nurse or your doctors, or at least even if they cannot work independently, there might be a doctor or a teacher in the loop, but it is going to solve, how to scale this scale healthcare and education. And these narratives, I do actually think very cynically are playing an active role in providing political cover for the defunding of public services in healthcare and education and so on. And I would even go as far to say as it is almost feels like as if the powers that be, their response to real needs of our society in terms of healthcare and education is let them eat chatbots. Um, and this is not, I think, this is a reflection that is emerging from a lot of tech workers, but even beyond tech workers, this concentration of power in the hands of big tech, I think, is causing also kind of increasing a lot of concern, even in the so-called global north, in, for example, in Europe, in Canada, where we are increasingly seeing narratives or call for digital sovereignty. And this is something that I do see as kind of something in a positive light, in terms of for example, in EU with the digital sovereignty narrative, they have been starting to work a lot more on thinking about what an open search platform might look like that could be alternative and can incorporate EU values. And I think this is an important step in a right direction. But I also am very much aware that, for example, Eurocentrism, we should be very clear, Eurocentrism is not a meaningful antidote to American exceptionalism, right? So we don't just need a open search platform that has European values. We need to remember that 85% of the world's population, or about so, lives in the so-called global south. And so we do need to, when we think about the creating public service platforms for information access, we need to think about not just Canada or Europe. We need to think about more holistically about how it meets the need of the whole world, including the global south, including marginalized populations in so-called global north. And this distinction, I think, is particularly important. So we've recently been doing some work where we've been kind of trying to tease apart some of these details about how, if you have a goal of, let's say, digital sovereignty versus you have a goal of how can information access support social justice, emancipation, and democracy, the kind of openness you want from these platforms is actually quite different, right? For example, just to give you a very kind of just a simple skeleton very reductionist kind of an example. Let's say if your goal was digital sovereignty and Europe were to build a open search platform, and then here comes another country that wants to have digital sovereignty similarly, and so now they can take the open platform and maybe modify it for their own use and build their own search access system. And maybe in this way, an open search platform does help getting different state actors and so on having digital sovereignty. But if your goal, for example, is, let's say, social justice, that a particularly historically marginalized group is being harmfully represented by a dominant search engine, even if the search engine was open in the sense that you could take and copy it, you have two problems. First of all, we cannot imagine that marginalized communities have the resources to take a search engine and just it's the code and whatever is made open is one thing, but it is also about is the tooling and the compute and the data labor, are all of those things also open? Are they also shared resources, right? Because without that, this a community, marginalized community, may not even have the resources to do anything with an open system. But also, even more importantly, even if the marginalized community were to be able to take this system and create their own system in which the community is represented, not harmfully, it doesn't solve the problem that the original search system that has a huge user usage is still has the original kind of the harmful representation of the community. So in this case, the kind of openness you need to address social justice is where the communities are allowed explicitly and encouraged to go and actually contribute back to the original system and co-opt and co-construct it for their own struggle for social justice and liberation. And so we talk about this a little bit. And again, one of these recent work that we did that is currently under review, where we look at Amartya Sen's capability theory from welfare economics, specifically to kind of formalize these ideas and start working towards more of a framework of how we should approach these questions. And so, having done a bit of doom and gloom early in the afternoon for you all, for me in Montreal and Jojage Montreal a little early in the morning, I want to focus for the rest of this talk to talk a little bit on to encourage us to think about, so what should we actually do? What should we actually build in lieu of what exists today? And specifically, I would frame this as, how can IR ensure that information access technologies actually act as a force of societal good, not just try to mitigate its harm, but actually act as a force of societal good that centers the need of marginalized and the oppressed communities. And so, on this particular topic, before going forward, I would actually like to go a little bit back and explicitly, exactly 50 years back, and talk about this paper written by Belkin and Robertson, where they talk about the social responsibilities of information access and especially and also information retrieval communities. And one of the key points they talk about in this paper is that information science and information retrieval needs a theoretical foundation to define what we mean by societal good. And only then can we start working towards that notion of societal good, and not just working towards it, but it will also be the basis on which we actually disagree or refuse to pursue certain research directions or certain directions of scientific inquiry, because they stand in contradiction to the societal values and the societal needs that we want to uphold, right? And this is one of the things that I believe is important for the IR community and more broadly to think about, because this topic of societal good is still very, very much under theorized in IR. So what we are seeing is, in effect, I would argue that there is a lot of work that's happened under the banner of societal good that are either having very, very limited effect, or sometimes even potentially there are harmful things that are being portrayed under the banner of societal good, because we haven't actually agreed on what societal good means. So at a recent conference in Europe, it's called the European Conference on Information Retrieval, I had the privilege of being a co-chair for the IR for Good track, and we specifically took on this question, foregrounded it, and by taking this as the theme of the track, what is IR for Good? And we tried to do multiple different things to kind of create space for the community to talk about this. And specifically, one of the things we did is we encouraged the papers this year consider all the submissions, to include an explicit note about their theories of change, how they expect their work to affect societal good, and what kind of societal good are they aiming for, what are their assumptions for to realize their effect, their desired effects, and so on and so forth. And the idea was that at least if we start making this explicit in our scholarship, then future scholarship can analyze these, can critique these, and can build on these. And over time, this becomes part of our academics, scholarly process, to kind of start talking about what is the societal good we should be aiming for. I'm not saying that is enough, obviously, but that is one of the little pieces in a broader picture as I am kind of starting to view this landscape. The other aspect that I want to talk about is also to kind of understand the different type of work that is happening and that is emerging more recently in the field of IR. And one of the things that I find really useful recently, I started to kind of look at it from the different frames that exist in IR and how we see this work. And I would argue that there is today one of the dominant frame is what I would call as the liberal frame, and then more recently there is the critical frame that is emerging within the community. I'll try to talk through, I won't have a time to go through enough of the full details of this, but I'll try to at least touch on some of the important points between these, what distinguishes these frames. So by frame here, by the way, I'm talking about a set of goals, a set of methods and practices that associated with that goal, and then also the values, politics, and epistemologies that underline our work in this space. So for the liberal frame, I would say the liberal frame is particularly concerned with what is a good system. So a good system, for example, maybe should be fair. It should respect confidentiality. It should be transparent. It should be sustainable over the long term. Whereas the critical frame, in contrast, it is focused on the question of what is a good society. And then it works backwards to decide what the system needs to do for us to realize a good society. So here it talks about desired societal outcomes like social justice, emancipation, democracy, and so on and so forth. The liberal frame assumes that with emerging technologies, that the role of it is to basically mitigate harm. So for example, if with the emerging AI technologies, it might see its role as ensuring that these technologies are trying to make these technologies more fairer, more factual, more private, more transparent, explainable, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the critical frame, I think we approach the mitigation question. We still definitely care about the mitigation question, but maybe a bit more from a socio-technical perspective. But beyond mitigation, we also keep the door open that certain technologies, if their outcome is largely harmful to society, maybe it is not about making them fairer or more transparent. Maybe the option is to refuse building these technologies and to actually imagine and build counter technologies in their place. And also to do this not in isolation from kind of divorced from the socio-political developments in the world, but to actually foreground praxis and ground our work in what is happening in the world, the actual real struggles for liberation movements that are ongoing, and to see those the role of struggles and movement building in our research. Last but not the least, in terms of the values, politics, and epistemologies, I would argue that in the liberal frame, typically, they try to kind of take a bit of try to kind of portray themselves as largely apolitical, but that doesn't mean it is actually apolitical. It definitely has politics, and the politics, I would say, espouses more like the values of individual rights, equality, freedom of speech, and market economics. It is also philosophically has a very positivist notion of information, and has also kind of values like technological and instrumental rationality. I'll talk about a bit about this in coming slides. And on the critical side, I think it is explicitly political, and it is politically non-dominative, decolonial, anti-racist, feminist, queer, pro-labor, anti-capitalist, anti-caste-based, anti-ableist, and abolitionist. And philosophically, there's a much bigger emphasis on social constructionism, and it is, as I mentioned, it is principally non-dominative. And so in IR, we see a bit of this transition happening. So, for example, we have this workshop that happens every 6 to 8 years, a strategy workshop where a group of different group of IR people would get together and talk about what's the important question for the next 5 to 10 years. And so if you go back to the third strategic workshop, this is called Swirl. in 2018, that is when I would say the first time kind of like, the community really recognized the importance of these concerns of fairness, accountability, confidentiality, and transparency, what they called as fact IR. And following that, we see like, workshops like Facts IR, which also added safety, kind of happened, which starts talking about kind of the these topics, but from a bit of more of a liberal frame. And then, like, move forward to the next swirl happening 7 years later in last year. And this is exactly in the swirl where the conversation now changes, because already the community is talking about, like, the um, sorry, I'm just trying to get the yeah. So already the community is starting to talk about the importance of explicating our kind of normative values or reconnecting back with our interdisciplinary roots. So this in 2025, the swirl particularly then moved away from talking about fairness and confidentiality, transparency, and so on, to start talking about centering social justice, democracy, and emancipation in the context of our work. And following up from the SWORL 2025, a few of us are organizing this year and later this summer also a workshop at SIGIR on justice, emancipation, democracy, and information access called the JEDI workshop. And I will do a quick call out of that at the end of this talk. Okay, so moving forward, so there are five, I would say, five distinctive features from this that kind of emerges for the critical frame, and some of it I already kind of touched upon in the the two slides ago. And so these five kind of distinctive features I would call are the structural analysis. So the critical IR frame grounds itself in kind of like critical theories and understanding of how kind of this how structurally a structural understanding of how different systems of oppression intersects with each other, and so we need to ground IR in within that kind of structural analysis. The non-domination this is the explicit alignment with in solidarity with the oppressed, and the explicit goal of dismantling all forms of domination or oppression, systems of oppression. The third one is the social construction of technology. So this is where we want to reject technological determinism, the idea that technology basically evolves by its own logic of efficiency, and then society just effectively just kind of adapts itself around technological development, or technological rationality, that the goal of society is to just progress technology. That's our primary goal, and but not to kind of at the cost of social and political progress. And so this is the critical frame would say that like the normative position is sorry it would reject the technological determinism and technological rationality in favor of reimagining what our socio-technical futures can be, and explicitly aligning that in terms of non-domination with anti-oppressive futures. And then the last two includes social construction of knowledge. So I briefly kind of alluded to this earlier. It about renouncing the kind of the positivist and commodifying views of information, and also kind of the typical traditional role that has been ascribed to IR within capitalist logic of information consumption, and replacing that with a reframing of IR as kind of the tools that play an important role within a complex social, socio-political ecosystem of sense making and knowledge production. And I will kind of go into a bit more details soon on these topics. Last but not the least, as I've been kind of mentioning already a couple of times before, is that it also reaffirms the importance of praxis as well as movement building within our research practices. So I want to quickly talk about five of these, a little bit more how it reflects within the IR frame and what kind of changes we need or what kind of changes might already be happening. So for the structural analysis, what I really want to argue is that rigorous IR scholarship cannot emerge from a reactionary understanding of our world. And this is where IR needs to be grounded in a structural and understanding of the metrics of domination and so on and so forth. And so what this means in practice is, for example, you might, if you pay attention to some of the discussion around AI, I think it's really hard not to be bombarded with these discourse today. So if you pay attention, there's a lot of focus on talking about AI hallucination and kind of how it produces fake information. There's a lot of discussion about bias in these models. But I think a systemic view would require us to take a much bigger look at this picture. So not just about bias in the models, but talking about how these systems actually shift and concentrate power. How does this system not just produce, hallucinate, but they actually disrupt the information ecosystem, both in terms of how the technology works, but also the kind of the economic the ecosystem around it, the political ecosystem around it, and all of those. And to do this in IR, a field that is deeply just like grounded only in computing, I think it is really important for the community to now reach out and connect with relevant, both like engage with relevant epistemologies like critical theories, feminist theories, decolonial theories, and start collaborating like with other disciplines such as information science, such as library sciences, such as science and technology studies, and so on and so forth, as well as looking to other forms of knowledge from like practices like library practices, activism, political organizing, and movement building. And this is something that is very close to my heart, and this was something I got me really excited when Darren first reached out to me and invited me to give this keynote, because I think one of the things that we need to do is for IR to reconnect back with its roots in library and information sciences. And I remember seeing this graphic for the conference, and honestly, I got really kind of like, and I'll confess, I got really excited, and I kind of took the liberty. I felt like I had to recreate a version of what I would want to, how I want to see the same discourse actually within IR where we're not today. I would love to hear people in the IR community start talking about decolonizing IR or queering IR or unionizing IR and so on and so forth. So I do really hope that if there's one goal of my conversation here is that I start hopefully building some bridges between IR community and the library information science, especially for how IR can learn from some of these topics that library and information science has historically looked at for a much longer time than we have, and we can learn from some of your scholarship, your actual lived experiences and practices, and so on and so forth. So moving on from the structural analysis, the next one is about non-domination. So one of the things that particularly distinguishes critical theory, and again, I don't need to belabor this point. There were multiple talks yesterday around critical theory in library sciences. And so but I was just kind of just to kind of mention this. So one of the important distinctive feature of critical theory is its explicit alignment in solidarity with the dominated and the oppressed, and its explicit goal for the abolishment of all forms of oppression and domination. And so critical theory is fundamentally is anti-capitalist. It is intellectual class struggle. It struggles for a classless, non-dominative, cooperative, participatory democracy. So very much kind of aligned with this ethos in my own research. I've been trying to, in recent years, trying to build a research agenda around emancipatory IR, which I define as the study and development of information access methods that challenge all forms of human oppression and situates its activities within broader collective emancipatory praxis. And so here, when I say emancipatory, I am really trying to kind of signify the concerns of universal humanization and universal liberation from any forms of oppression, especially systemic forms of oppression. And when I'm talking about the different forms of oppression, I am again referring to kind of the systems of such as colonialism, racism, patriarchy, casteism, transphobia, ableism, and so on and so forth. Last but not the least, I intentionally emphasize the importance of kind of a performativity in the space and discourage non-performative, the academic gaze, and the importance of grounding this research in movement practices and organizing practices, as well as seeing movement building and organizing as a core research activity within the field. And so within the work, I'm not going to go a lot in details, but just to kind of give you a little bit of overview, I try to start building a little framework of practices, projects, and provocations. So the practices here I talk about, and this is again looking at some of the other scholarship in emancipatory from social sciences. I borrow some of these ideas around the practices of structurally diagnosing and critique the systems that exist today, imagining viable alternatives, and then elaborating theories of change and actually implementing those alternative systems systems. For the projects here, as you see, with the practices are kind of drawn, visualized as kind of circling around the projects. The projects here, I intentionally kind of draw them as kind of like, these kind of blocks, and with keep a few blocks empty, because to signify that this is not a complete list of projects, but just ideas. But the kind of projects we might consider is how can IR systems, for example, protect itself from authoritarian capture? How can it prevent, like, ingrained, like kind of, how can it prevent how much user surveillance is built into these platforms? How can we prevent these platforms becoming tools of manipulation and persuasion, and so on and so forth? And last but not the least, the provocation is depicted as kind of a, like, a nudging hand. And this might include, like, again, interdisciplinary scholarship, engaging with other epistemologies and other things that can help us break out of our status quo thinking. Um, so keep going forward also to the next point. So I mentioned about the social construction of technology. So as I mentioned earlier, this is really about, like, countering this technological deterministic ideas, for example, that AI is inevitable and is going to take over the world and everything that we do, and countering that with asking questions in our field about whose socio-technical imaginaries are granted normative status, and what kind of, like, radical alternatives are we overlooking, and how much of this is happening because of the dominance of big tech in our academic circles, and how and the funding mechanisms, and so on and so forth, and how it homogenizes the kind of systems that we can even imagine for ourselves. And last but not the least, it is also a provocation for us to think about what IR systems would look like if it was informed by feminist, queer, decolonial, and other liberatory epistemologies. So to give you a very concrete example here, one of the kind of stereotypical example when people talk about fairness in kind of search context is this, like, you do a query for CEO, and this is, let's say, for an image search result, and all the results are pretty much all the results are male and predominantly white male, right? And so the liberal kind of temptation here is to look at it from a fairness construct, and think about how we can, like, change this SERP to include more women, people of color, women of color, and so on and so forth. But here is a question, right? And I'm going to be a little cynical. Like, what does that really change, affect in the real world? This is not an argument against making sure our systems are fair, but the critical frame might give us some other avenues to also explore. So consider the other radical alternatives where we don't change this page. We keep it as it is, but we take space on that search result page and give it to feminist, queer, anti-racist scholars, activists, and artists to co-opt and actually teach about the history of erasure of, like, women's labor, of racial labor, of how these, like, labor of women and people of color have been systemically undervalued. And that then becomes a pedagogical tool from information access towards kind of, like, affecting social change. And again, there is lots of deep questions underneath it, talking about, like, for example, how do we make sure this is really about pedagogy and not kind of, like, ideological indoctrination, or who gets to decide what emancipatory things? And that these are deeper questions that I will briefly touch upon in this talk. But again, most of these questions are definitely open questions, because I'm definitely not coming here with the solutions in my pocket, in my skill set, tool set. Okay, so hopefully that kind of, like, moving from the social construction of technology, I want to now talk about the social construction of knowledge. So in a typical kind of, again, liberal positivist kind of view of information is typically viewed as an artifact or a commodity, and it is valued through the lens of, like, how relevant it is it to the information need expressed by the user. What might be how authoritative might the source of the information might be, or how factual it might be, right? So these are some of the lenses through which information would be valued in a kind of a positivist and a capitalist kind of a lens of information. And in this context, like, the IR system becomes independent of the corpus that exists and the information needs that exist. And it's only seen as basically the system that matches the information artifacts from the corpus, which are, the supply, supply side, and with the information needs, let's just say, like for example, search queries on in a search engine, which is the demand side of the of this scenario, right? So the IR system then is just about matching supply with demand. And so obviously, if you think of IR as this in this way, then a lot of the IR work obviously then ends up being about pre-curated data sets with a corpus and a set of queries, and then people will use these data sets for model training, system development, and evaluation. Now, imagine a very different kind of like, a social constructionist view of information, where information and knowledge are socially constructed within the kind of like, under the influence of the power relations within society. And so in this context, IR systems become integral to our collective sense making and knowledge production, and it cannot no longer be divorced from social and the political context in which it exists. So instead of now seeing IR system that should match the artifacts in the corpus to the information needs, now we imagine a much more dynamic and sophisticated information ecosystem where these tools exist. And now we are not just like optimizing these tools to show more relevant or more authoritative content. We are actually trying to optimize these systems or build these systems and evaluating and appraising the systems with respect to how does it affect our overall collective understanding of our physical and social environments and our relationships with them, right? So this is about, could be like, how does it increase our public health knowledge? How does it increase our socio-political consciousness, right? So how, and this is the kind of much more expansive view of IR that I think the critical frame pushes us towards. And so in this context, if we talk about the knowledge and information is socially constructed, we should also ask then what is the role of community in constructing the social construction of information access itself? And let's not forget, we still have to go back and talk about how do we safeguard against authoritarian and ideological capture of our platforms. So here, I just want to quickly mention, like, if you look at the social media space, especially this question of authoritarian capture has been very dominant in recent few years. And so one of the directions people have been thinking about particularly is decentralized social media platforms. And I do think that is an important piece of the puzzle, but only a piece of the puzzle, because I think it's definitely not sufficient to just decentralize the technological infrastructure. We absolutely need to decentralize the social infrastructure necessary for moderation, for governance, and other aspects over this platform. I'm not going to have a chance to really go into the details of this, but I strongly recommend for people who are interested to look at this particular podcast episode with Dr. Jonathan Flower about the whiteness of Mastodon, that really kind of touches upon some of these critical issues in details and had a very big impact on even how I've been thinking about this work. And so in an alternative approach, I've been doing some work recently, and this is a work that we are about to submit to a conference, to a venue, where we started looking at particularly Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed and his theories about emancipatory pedagogy. And how that might tell us something, give us some clues about emancipatory information access. Paulo Freire, by the way, I will be very honest and confess, has had a huge impact on my own political beliefs and probably has been the book and the work that kind of shaped a lot of my own work. And so and again, I assume most of you here in this audience are probably very familiar with Freire. But I'm just kind of like, just to kind of reiterate, Freire's work focuses on critiquing the banking model of education and the idea of the teacher as the liberator, whose job is to just like, deposit their teaching, their expertise, and it is the role of the student to patiently receive and memorize and repeat. And so he critiques this kind of teacher-student duality, and instead says, like, advocates for a problem-posing dialogue between the teacher and the student that engages the student in a critical reflection of their own state of oppression and in developing their own strategies and action for their own liberation. And so he puts it as, like, I want to quote, the conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for their liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientism. And so one of the things that we started thinking about is that there is a very similar parallel in tech, where there is also a similar dichotomy that exists between technologists and users, and this very dominant frame that paints the technologist as the liberator. And I think this is fundamentally problematic. So what do I mean by this? So technologist here in this context is the people who envision and build let's say, information access technologies in this particular context. And users are the people who seek information using these tools. And by having this kind of division of labor or responsibilities, we are directly making the technologies the gatekeeper of knowledge and knowledge production, and giving them tremendous influence over our collective sense making, as well as turning the communities and people who use these technologies as object of technological influence to be modeled, to be monitored, to be manipulated for their so-called their benefit. And so here, to challenge the technologist as liberator frame, what we are really talking about, it's not to say that the technologies don't have a role, but it is to make the role for the users to co-opt and co-construct the technology for their own struggles for liberation. And just to quickly again quote Freire here, he talks about to the well-intentioned converts, or I would say the people who in the tech sphere have been thinking of society but still haven't felt comfortable to let go of control of those discourse. And to them, I would kind of quote Freire when he says, "Our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe they must be the executors of transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them, and trusting the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in the struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without that trust." So from this, we started developing a notion of Freirean design, which is explicitly a design methodology and a political commitment to engage the user in active co-option and co-construction of the technology, and kind of builds on kind of historical kind of strands of computing scholarship and research in lines with participatory design and kind of pushing the boundaries on that. And so here in this context, the inclusion of the oppressed is not obviously not symbolic. There's this very fundamental reason why this is necessary, because as Freire also argues in a pedagogical context, even here, technologists cannot gift epistemic or representational justice to the marginalized. And it is something for the marginalized to struggle, and it is they who are likely to take the risk to overthrow their oppression and oppose their oppression to make the changes that technologists are unlikely to make and take the risks for. It is also important to recognize that the historical cultural context and structures of oppression are very quite different from the, let's say, the inner cities and neighborhoods in the US to the favelas of Rios to the bastis in Kolkata. And so it is also very important that we ground these work and the thinking in the community who are and their knowledge, and not again erase their knowledge of generational knowledge in these spaces in our work. And last but not the least, when you get have a space for communities to co-opt and co-construct the technology, that also becomes a site for not just technological change, but also social change, a site for building solidarity and movements. And so then in this context, the role of the technologist in the Freirean design framework becomes one of problem posing the material risks, deconstructing some of the material risks and presenting it as an object of study to the people to encourage them to see themselves as necessary makers of technology in support of their own liberation. As well as to kind of under design the core platform and to kind of bake in the design by which it allows communities to co-opt and co-construct the technology for their own struggles. So those becomes the new the role of the or goals of the technologist in the Freirean design paradigm. And last note on this, I would say that the Freudian design, when we're talking about it, we definitely don't imagine this to be a miracle cure for our ailing growth of authoritarianism or oppression. What we are really saying is that the actual key is in the structural encoding of spaces for community participation, collective deliberation, and democratic negotiation within these technologies. And it is not about technological change. That's not the key. It is about encoding social spaces within the technology. And then at the end of the day, even that is not sufficient. What will finally decide what the outcome will be is the socio-politics within those spaces, the socio-political arrangements, right? So we have to ensure that not only do we create those spaces, but those spaces have liberatory, emancipatory politics. And that is the kind of the vision that I am kind of like, my own research kind of is working on, where we are trying to imagine these kind of public information access platform that is do not allow for authoritarian capture by not centralizing control, but also does not just push all the responsibilities to the leaf nodes kind of modern libertarian notion of everybody makes decisions for themselves, but rather thinking about how information access can be socially constructed, but more through a complex kind of organization of democratic processes and institutions and people. Last but not the least, in the critical frame is the topic of praxis. So this will be, as I keep kind of alluding to throughout this talk, it's about like turning also not just doing research activities, but also taking explicit action. So, for example, building consensus on the community about the red lines that we should not cross in our research. So, for example, I personally believe IR should not work on generative ads. It is completely problematic generative ads. Also, it would be about investing in building counter structures like counter technologies like public service IR platform, or exploring worker-owned cooperatives and other alternatives for for-profit big tech. It would be about thinking about organizing and movement building within IR communities and raising our socio-political consciousness. It would be about how do we do public education about things that we need to have engaged civil society and push back against some of the things, the developments in the technological sphere that is happening today. It is about DEI and making sure it's not just about including people from historically marginalized groups, but also their values and radical libertary ideologies and making space for those. It is not just to include people of color and women and non-binary and other members of those communities who have given up their beliefs and their their values only to kind of adopt a again kind of a patriarchal white capitalist values, right? So it is making sure that we are making space for those values and socio-political values in our community. And last but not the least, we definitely an important aspect of this is that it has to be grounded in a in notions of community care. This kind of work is going to be inherently risky, and so we have to think about how to protect our members. We have to think about how to fund this kind of research, and also kind of creating infrastructure of care for all of the communities who today in the real world outside of our academic circle is facing immigration violence, is getting denied healthcare, their identities, is getting worrying about themselves or their family members being affected by ongoing war, genocide, settler colonialism, and everything that's ongoing in the world right now. And so typically when I give this talk in a more of an IR forum, and I have people who come up to me and ask me, so where do I start? Where do IR people start for this? I typically talk to them about doing a lot of reading and using reading as a form of also community development, community organizing by creating book clubs and reading groups. But honestly, in this forum, I don't think I have to talk about this at all. In fact, as I was making the slides, I was basically kind of actually telling myself that in future I'm going to be telling IR people to not just read books, but reach out to a librarian, reach out and talk to them about how, and let them help you to kind of go on that journey that I do believe strongly librarian and library sciences have taken and have done a lot of the groundwork that IR should be learning from. I mentioned that in this summer we have a workshop that we are organizing. We would really love to kind of have people from other disciplines, and even not just scholars but also practitioners, library from library sciences, like from working in libraries, but also people working in movement organizing and so on. So if and this workshop is happening at Sigaya 2026, which is happening in Melbourne, Australia. So if you are going to be in Australia, or if you know anyone there who would like to attend, please do share this with them. I also linked here the kind of the Blue Sky and Mastodon accounts, so please feel free to follow us. And obviously, all of these links and pointers will be in the slides that have already been shared. And so with that, I will end my presentation here. Sorry, I haven't left a lot of time for questions, but hopefully I can take maybe one or two quick questions. But I want to end with reading out a little passage from one of our recent papers. So it goes, our movement begins here. We are moved not by the opportunity to imagine a different socio-technical future, by the abject necessity of it in the face of growing authoritarianism and oppression. We do not move alone, but in solidarity with others, because our liberation and the struggle for it are bound together. We move not in fear, but with courage and out of love for our own humanity and that of others. Where the oppressor attempts to capture and control, we move to co opt, co construct, and liberate. We move not just to negate oppression, but to create something new, something joyful, something emancipatory. Thank you so much for having me here today. It has been an absolute, absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting and so much for us to take away and digest. If we could please express our thanks in the chat or with a reaction. And we probably have got time for one or two questions. I could see there was one from Nadine in the chat, which I'll just read it out as it's been written. So it says, in terms of the information content and algorithms embedded in the current information retrieval systems, what would be required for these new alternative systems? Is it starting from scratch, or how else could this transition stroke transfer happen? Especially thinking about bibliographic databases or platforms like Google, Amazon that have core users and information. Maybe it's a simplistic frame, but I'm thinking of how we move from one social media platform to another. But while there's an implied loss, there is also a gradual change.
Yeah, I love this question. I think that is one of the real challenges in this space where we need to simultaneously think about what this radically different platform looks like that exists in a radical different world that we want to build towards, but also at the same time think about how we go from where we are today to where we need to be, right? Because I don't think we should be wholesale abandoning the platforms that exist today. And in fact, actually, you know what? I'm going to summarize this by kind of quoting Audre Lorde. I think this reminds me of this whole conversation, this her quote about the master's tool will not dismantle the master's house. And I know that this particular quote gets thrown around very often and almost misquoted to kind of say that, to kind of imply that everything that has been built through the colonial lens or through the kind of lens of racism should be wholesale abandoned and we should be reimagining something different. Whereas my interpretation of Audre Lorde's what she was saying in this context is something different, which is that it is to kind of really, really mindfully recognize that everything, the platforms and the systems and our community social arrangements, they're all basically kind of infected and contaminated with racial, colonial, and other values. And that doesn't mean that we just completely walk away from everything that exists and build something new. It is about doing the new work and starting to build something radically different with this acknowledgement. So today, when we talk about IR, I think there are lots of pieces in IR, in ranking and fairness and other contexts that I do think has a role on the other side through the critical lens. But to do that work on the other side, we also need to take a step back and give ourselves the freedom to really reimagine different radical things. And this is where we need to bring in the community, right? So what would a queer, Dalit, people who have done the work of advocacy advocacy right groups, what would be their idea of what kind of representation that queer Dalit community wants, or what would be the kind of so what would be the kind of representation they want in through their information access systems, and to kind of imagine how can information access systems teach about queer Dalit history, for example. I'm just taking that as an example here. And so what I think we need is a lot of experimentation about both from what information experiences might look like, a lot of experiments on what does decentralized information access platforms look like, and then start putting those pieces together. And to do this work, not from centralizing it within the technologies community, but open it up so that communities can start experimenting with this. And from that, I think the answers will slowly emerge from this messy process. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but hopefully I touched
That's
upon some
fine.
of the things.
Oh no, that was, and it's always good to end with a Lord quote as well. So thank you again so much. We're going to wrap up there to make sure everybody can have a break. I have dropped the information about our wall of thanks. So if you want to express any thanks for today's keynote or any other sessions that you've attended over the last day and a bit, thank you very much. So we're going to take a break. Next session will be back at 1:15. watched. Again, I always say it, please do step away from your screens, go play with a pet, or look at a tree. And thank you very much, everybody. And thank you especially, Bhaskar. That was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.